Okay, so I will start and say good evening to everyone, and welcome to our latest Take Drugs Seriously event to launch our new briefing called Reforming Drug Policies to Reduce Trafficking and Exploitation, which is now available on the Anyone's Child website for you to download. My name is Jane Slater. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive Officer at Transform Drug Policy Foundation, and I will be chairing tonight's discussion. I also run a campaign called Anyone's Child, Families for Safer Drug Control, which is led by families whose lives have been destroyed by the drug war and who are now campaigning for the legal control and regulation of the drug market. This briefing is our first effort to lay out how our current drug policies are fueling the exploitation and trafficking of very vulnerable people, increasingly children, both in the UK and internationally. And it includes an array of case studies of those whose lives have been impacted. This briefing is aimed at reaching out to those who are working to protect the victims of trafficking and those involved in child protection, to encourage them to join in this important discussion. It is our view that through regulating the drugs market, that we would remove a major profit motive and opportunity for this exploitation, as our panel is going to expand upon. In short, we think that through innovative drug policy reform, we can better protect victims and prevent others from suffering. This conversation is long overdue, and I'm so glad it's happening tonight, and I'm delighted to be joined by such an esteemed panel of experts tonight. If you're listening, I'd like you to join in this conversation. Please do ask your questions. We're going to have a question and answer session at the end, and we'd like you to send in your questions. There'll also be a survey that will come up at the end of the webinar in your browser. Please do fill this in, it would be really helpful for us. And I'd like to start by handing over to Ester Kincova, who is the Research Officer at Transform Drug Policy Foundation and one of the co-authors of this briefing. So with no further ado, thank you very much, Ester.
Hi Jane, and hello everyone. I'm pleased that you've been able to join us this evening as we discuss this important topic. So I'll just quickly take you through the key areas of this briefing: reforming drug policies to reduce trafficking and exploitation of vulnerable people. This briefing looks at the complex relationship between the illegal drug trade and trafficking and exploitation, both within the UK and internationally, seeking to show that when discussing trafficking and exploitation, we really need to be talking about drug policy. We focus on four main areas: the trafficking of young and vulnerable people for forced labour to work in drug farms, the exploitation of young and vulnerable people to transport and sell drugs, which looks at the exploitation of women and girls in drug supply, as well as child exploitation in county lines in the UK. And lastly, how the criminalisation and marginalisation of vulnerable people puts them at risk of exploitation within the legal drug trade. Prohibition has placed the entire drug market into the hands of organised crime groups, and the illegal market is lucrative and is continuing to expand. It is now estimated to be worth almost $650 billion worldwide. Operating entirely without regulatory oversight means organised crime groups are exploiting children and vulnerable people to maximise their profit and to evade law enforcement. And more than 17% of potential victims of trafficking or slavery identified in the UK last year were exploited as part of the illegal drug trade. So looking firstly at forced labour and drug cultivation in the UK, in particular cannabis, it's worth noting that the UK illegal cannabis industry is worth £2 billion, and most of this cannabis is now grown domestically. The cultivation of cannabis requires regular tending, and in order to both maximise profit and to lower the risk of detection by law enforcement, organised crime groups often traffic children and young people from abroad and enslave them as so-called gardeners. Last year, 714 people were identified as potential victims of trafficking and modern slavery in relation to cannabis cultivation, and of these, 172 were children. Victims are often locked inside properties to tend to the cannabis crop, and being locked out of sight, as well as often having fear of the authorities instilled in them. These victims can be difficult to detect and identify. And also, unfortunately, where a victim has been able to escape, they are often too often treated as either an immigration offender or a criminal working voluntarily in the drug trade before being treated as a victim. Moving on, looking at the exploitation of young and vulnerable people to transport and sell drugs, the issue of county lines has been identified as a major form of criminal exploitation in the UK in recent years. These are drug supply networks set up by organised crime groups, which often exploit children or vulnerable adults as drug runners or dealers. And last year, 1,139 people were identified as potential victims in relation to county lines. 1,001 of these were children, although numbers are likely to be far higher, with research indicating that there may be 2,000 children linked to county lines in London alone. Young and vulnerable people are more likely to be exploited in county lines as they are difficult for police to detect, but also easier to exploit and intimidate, and can be readily replaced. Unfortunately, victims are less likely to seek help because they fear arrest if they disclose what is happening to them. And we found that county lines on this current scale is a direct consequence of prohibition. This is evidenced in the government's independent review into drug misuse, which found that new supply networks often emerge only after effective police campaigns to disrupt supply chains. We then looked at the exploitation of women and girls in drug supply. Women are disproportionately imprisoned for drug supply offences around the world. 35% of female prison population is imprisoned for drug-related offences worldwide, and this compares to 19% for men. Noted by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, women are often forced to carry out low-level drug activities either through coercion or intimidation, or having been deceived, and sometimes also participating in an attempt to help their loved ones. They tend to play a low-level role in drug supply, which makes them far more expendable to organised crime groups, and also more likely to be identified by law enforcement than higher-level actors. Imprisoning low-level female drug offenders, many already victims of exploitation, has a considerably negative impact on their life opportunities, increasing their risk of becoming homeless, perpetuating their cycle of poverty, and putting them at further risk of exploitation in drug markets. There is nothing that actually, further the imprisonment of women can have a negative impact down the generations, with many children being either left without their mothers or being incarcerated alongside them, and 19,000 children are currently recorded as such worldwide. Finally, the briefing highlights how prohibition increases the risk of people with problematic drug use to be exploited by organised crime groups and become victims of trafficking. The UK National Crime Agency has identified these are the most vulnerable group of adults to be targeted in county lines in particular. In this case, organised crime groups supply vulnerable adults with drugs, creating a drug debt that individuals are then forced to pay off by working on a county line, either by running drugs or having them used having their homes used for drugs transactions. Their risk of sexual exploitation, as well as trafficking into forced prostitution or financial exploitation, are also high. This vulnerable group of people needs sympathy and support rather than punitive drug laws, which make their problematic drug use a criminal justice issue instead of a health issue. This can further marginalise them and move them away from support networks that they really need. They're already a high-risk group, and this further pushes them towards organised crime groups, leaving them at risk of grooming and intimidation. And so what can be done? There are a number of ways to rectify these problems. It is clear that prohibition is failing to protect the young and vulnerable from trafficking and exploitation. Legally regulating the production, supply, and possession of illegal drugs would both remove the opportunity and profit motive for exploitation in the drug trade. Only through legal regulation can we put the state, rather than organised crime, in control of production and supply of drugs. And it will give governments the ability to combat exploitation by providing strict labour standards and regulation, as we see in other industries. Vulnerable individuals who currently purchase drugs on the illegal market would not be criminalised and instead be offered support, as well as having the chance to purchase from a safe legal source. Consequently, this would decrease their interactions with organised crime groups that put them at risk of exploitation. We're not arguing legal regulation is a silver bullet. However, the illegal trade does provide unmatched opportunities for profit for organised crime groups. An illegally regulated drug market would shrink the demand for illegal supply, taking the profit incentive away. We need effective and innovative drug policy reform in order to better protect victims and prevent others from suffering in the future. And we hope that now is the time to recognize that drug prohibition is actively fueling human exploitation and slavery. Thank you for listening, and please take a look at our full report, which will be on the Anyone's Child website, and I will also provide a link in the chat later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther, for that talk. And actually, I've just shared a link to the briefing, so please do check it out. And thank you for the summary of that. I can see there's some interesting people on this call and listening, so please do get your questions coming in on the chat, and we can start to answer some of those at the end of this call. I'm really excited now to introduce Coletta Youngers. Coletta is a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America. She's one of the world's leading experts on international drug control policies and drug policy related developments in Latin America, and is an absolute queen of the drug policy field. So I'm absolutely delighted to hand over to her. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'd also add that I'm a senior associate with the International Drug Policy Consortium. So I would like to thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar, and I really want to congratulate Transform and Anyone's Child for this groundbreaking research and report. We do not hear enough or know enough about how human trafficking and drug trafficking are intertwined, and I think this report lays that out in a very clear and comprehensive way, and really shows the human side and how people are doubly victimized, first by traffickers and then by the criminal justice system. So the focus of my work right now is on women, drug policy, and incarceration in Latin America. So I'm going to talk about this from that perspective. Though having said that, these trends are sadly universal. So as part of our work, we've also sought to show the human face of the so-called war on drugs and elevate the voices of women, particularly the women who've been in prison, who are in prison or have been in prison. So I'm going to try and weave those stories into my short presentation here. So just to put this in context, the incarceration of women is increasing at alarming rates, and this is particularly true in Latin America and Asia, and at rates much faster than those of men. According to the World Prison Report, over the last 2 decades, the incarceration of women in the Americas has increased by about 57%, while that of men has risen by about 19%. So while it's true that there are many more men, obviously, behind bars than women, women are the fastest growing prison population. It's also important to note that punitive drug laws are the driving force behind incarceration in Latin America, and other parts of the world as well, of course, and disproportionately affect women. For men, we find that the percentage of the male prison population incarcerated for drug offenses tends to be between 20 and 25%, depending on the country. In the case of women, it tends to be 40%, or even 50 or 60%, and we find cases where 80% of women behind bars are there for drug offenses. So actually, just to give you one example, in the case of Brazil, 68% of women are in prison for drug offenses as compared to 26% of men. You see the difference. So who are these women? Generally, they live in situations of poverty and marginalization. They have low levels of education. They face greater economic vulnerability than men. They're unemployed or underemployed. They're primary caregivers for dependent children or the elderly. They're usually the victims of domestic violence before and during incarceration. Violence and torture during incarceration. Many suffer from mental health issues and or a drug dependency, and the vast majority are mothers, and the vast majority of those are single mothers. So a lot of women get involved in the drug trade out of economic desperation. They end up getting criminalized for being poor. These women are simply trying to put food on the table for their kids. I've heard story after story of women who couldn't make ends meet, sometimes felt that their choice was either prostitution or selling drugs. And basically in desperation, they get involved in the drug trade. And it's important to note too that selling drugs out of your house or periodically transporting drugs can also be a way to combine childcare responsibilities with earning money. So at the same time that there are these women who opt for that, women are often targeted for recruitment by traffickers precisely because of their situations of vulnerability, either by being coerced into getting involved in the first place or further exploited once they are involved in the drug trade. It will come as no surprise that women operate at the lowest levels of organized crime. They are generally involved in small-scale drug dealing, transporting drugs within a country or across borders, smuggling drugs into prison, and cultivating plants for processing controlled substances. These women are not getting rich. They're not members of organized crime, but they're engaged in very, very risky activities. It's also important to point out that with few exceptions, the women involved in the drug trade are expendable and easily replaced. And law enforcement efforts tend to target those easiest to arrest, ensuring that more and more women go to prison. This is all a very good deal for those traffickers who are exploiting it. When I started this work, I confess, I didn't think about it in the context of human trafficking. And I also confess that when you asked me to participate in this webinar, I went up and looked up the definition of human trafficking and realized that I had created a very narrow idea of the women I considered to be victims of drug trafficking and human trafficking. And in fact, by definition, it is a much wider range of people. And I'll talk about that in a minute here. So I talked to a lot of women who are in prison, who are coming out of prison. And the stories tend to be very similar. And what I found is that this kind of human trafficking intertwined with drug trafficking can take many forms. So I'm just going to go through a few examples. So in Mexico, for example, there are cases where women come from a community where the entire economy revolves around cannabis or opium cultivation. There are places that are totally controlled by traffickers where you're forced to do it at gunpoint, but there's a lot of other places where it's just the only job in town. So we did a video with a woman named Gabby, who comes from an indigenous community in Guerrero. Everybody in that community is involved in one way or another in the cannabis trade. She harvested cannabis for many years. She has 2 children, and the second child, she's a single mom, the second child was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. So suddenly she found herself with all of these medical bills, had a lot of expensive medicine she had to buy, had to do tests. And so one of the traffickers offered her the chance to carry a packet to Mexico City. And she did that. And as she arrived in Mexico City, she was captured and she ended up spending 10 years in prison. The judge would not listen to any of these extenuating circumstances, either at the time of her conviction or later when she was actually eligible for release. She was denied multiple times until we actually got some lawyers involved and she finally got out a few months ago. In a different kind of situation, women may be coerced by a partner or family member. I'll give you an example of a woman named Marta in Argentina. Her boyfriend asked her to carry a suitcase to Spain. She didn't really understand why, but she trusted him, so she did it. She was captured, spent 8 years in prison in Argentina. She was captured trying to go out of the country. So as was the case with Marta, many women may be tricked or deceived. They're unaware that the suitcase that they're carrying has drugs in it. They've been set up as a decoy at the airport, and this is very common. These women they will have alerted the police that these women are coming through to go after the decoy. And in the meantime, a much bigger drug shipment is getting in at the same time. One common story is something along these lines. The partner says he's running late. He can't get from his office to the house to pick up his suitcase for the vacation they're about to take. Can she just take the suitcase? Then he misses his flight at the airport and says, just take my stuff, go ahead, I'll meet you there, I'm taking the next flight. And of course, the woman gets to the other end and again is arrested and ends up spending a lot of time in prison. Another situation is when men in prison demand that their partners smuggle drugs into prison, saying that they will be hurt or even killed if they don't. Sometimes that may be true, sadly. Other times it's, obviously selling drugs in the prison context. There was one case in Costa Rica, a woman we called Jessica, who actually got up to the, close to where they were doing the review, body searches before people are able to go in and do visits. And she basically just said she realized that she was making a huge mistake, that she should not be doing this. She turned the drugs over to the police and they basically arrested her. and accused her of, treated her exactly as would have been the case had she smuggled those drugs into the prison. She ended up with an 8-year prison sentence. She was treated the same as if she had smuggled those drugs. And one of the hardest stories I listened to was another woman from Costa Rica, Johanna. So she agreed to carry drugs under her own volition to Venezuela, but she thought she'd be carrying a suitcase. She gets to the drop-off point, or the pickup point, I guess it would be, which was a hotel room, and realizes that no, she's supposed to carry it within her body. She tries to get out of it. They won't let her. They're threatening her at gunpoint. So she starts to swallow all these capsules. She can't do it anymore. When you swallow the capsules, your throat gets really raw. So finally, the man who was there with her rapes her so that she can put the capsules up her vagina. She almost died because she had so much drugs in her system and the capsules started bursting. So she gets to Venezuela. They rush her because she's turning blue as she's coming off the plane. They rush her to the hospital. They save her life, thank goodness. So she says, I'm so glad I was captured. But then she spent, I think it was, I can't remember, 8 or 10 years in prison in Venezuela, again in Caracas. And finally, and I'll end up with this, there are cases like Liliana, who was featured in the report. This is the sort of case that I always connected directly with human trafficking until, as I said before, I realized that really it's a much wider group of people. But Liliana is a Venezuelan woman with 2 children. She agreed to transport drugs under the threat that her family would be harmed if she refused. First, she was told it was just to Peru. She thought she'd go to Peru, come back, it would all be over with. But when she gets to Peru, they sent her to another country, then back, I think they sent her back to Venezuela, then to Ecuador, finally to Argentina, where in Argentina, she again was set up as the decoy and arrested immediately upon arrival in the airport. So these women are almost always caught in flagrante, and that's for transporting or selling drugs. They have the drugs on them. So they're forced to plea bargain, often without legal defense. They have no legal defense when they make these deals. So in Liliana's case, the judge didn't even consider the possibility that she was a victim of human trafficking. She was basically charged as a drug trafficker and sentenced to, I think she served 4, if I remember right, of an 8-year sentence in Buenos Aires, very far from her family and her kids. And all she wants to do is to get back home to her kids. So let me just conclude by saying that not only do we need to end the senseless prohibition of drugs now deemed to be illegal, we need to fundamentally rethink who we're putting into cages and why. We don't just need reform of the criminal justice system. We need a very different concept of justice, one based on providing people with what they need to live lives with dignity and developing community-based solutions to societal issues. We need to end the war on drugs and we need to end incarceration. And I will just stop there. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Coletta, for that very powerful and moving speech. You know, I often think that the media portrayal of what we would hear as a drug mule, for example, you know, there are all sorts of connotations, and I think it's very important to break down the people that we're actually talking about here, and to break down some of those media portrayals of these sort of very big organized criminals, which in fact are often impoverished women. And I think your presentation's done a very powerful job of breaking some of that down, so thank you very much. I'm now going to move over to Neil Woods. He spent 14 years, I don't even know if he needs an introduction to this audience, but spent 14 years working as an undercover police officer. He's author of the best-selling books Good Cop, Bad War and Drug War. He is a long-term friend of anyone's child, and he is chair of Law Enforcement Action Partnership. So thank you very much, Neil, for agreeing to speak tonight.
No problem. Thank you very much for inviting me, and well done on the report. I want to echo what Coletta said about what good work it is. I'm going to unsurprisingly concentrate on the issue of county lines in the UK, the exploitation of children and other vulnerable people to transport and sell drugs across the UK. I think in trying to work out what to do about any problem, we need to understand the origins of it. And we have to be clear that the origins of county lines is the success of police. it's a new thing for us to have children doing this. It's the last 6 years that it's been an epidemic, and we now have thousands of children involved. 20 years ago, this just wasn't the case. So we have to ask ourselves, what exactly has changed? What is different? I mean, the United States has had children selling drugs on street corners since the 1980s. Lots of other countries have had children doing this, but the UK is quite new to it. Well, the problem is that the police are really, really good at catching drug dealers. That is part of the problem, because the war on drugs is perhaps best not described as a war, better perhaps to describe it as an arms race, because law enforcement will always become more efficient and develop expertise in catching dealers, and working undercover, I worked with some of the cleverest and most hardworking police who developed obsessive expertise in what they were doing in catching drug dealers. So there's always a lot of work going into it. But the point is, the police can never reduce the size of the market, never. But us as police, we do change the shape of that market. Now, I'm going to give you an example. Some of you might have heard this before. It's my favourite example to give, but I did an undercover job in Northampton, and I'd actually given up undercover work just prior to that. I'd found it too emotionally disturbing, but I was tempted back into it, manipulated perhaps into it by a detective sergeant who described these particular gangsters. He said, they're far worse than any of the others that you've gone after. This gang, called the Burger Bar Boys, are using gang rape as part of their reputation building and their intimidation of the community. They're raping people for drug debts or for any reason that takes them. So I was tempted back into it. I thought, okay, I've got to catch these gangsters. And I manipulated some very vulnerable people into introducing me to this gang of 6 murderous gangsters who were controlling, who had moved into Northampton and taken over the heroin and crack cocaine market. Now, to rewind a little bit, the reason that the Burger Bar Boys had moved into Northampton and taken over control of that town was because the local police had had some extraordinary success against their local heroin dealers. There'd been a succession of raids, and they'd been caught, and it was celebrated in the local newspapers and the radio. But in that void, that's where the big gang from the big cities stepped in. So, as I say, I spent time getting introduced to them, and it took me several weeks. I had to create myself a legend. I had to go shoplifting with some of these vulnerable people. I had to trade in stolen property and, get myself trusted. Anyway, eventually, I got the introduction, started buying heroin and crack and gathering evidence of conspiracy against the 6 gang members which were running the trade in that town. This operation took me 7 months, and I ended up gathering evidence against a total of 96 people. The 6 gang members, who were the vicious ones, but also sex workers, problematic drug users who they were using as runners, all sorts of people involved. And at the end of that 7 months, I knew that I had no new phone numbers to get. I had no one else to get introduced to, no one else I had to get to know. I'd caught everybody, literally everybody who was involved in the trade in that town. I was well known amongst them. 7 months it took. And it was a difficult job. I mean, there was one day when I decided on a whim or a bit of suspicion not to wear a secret camera that I'd been wearing. I was glad I decided not to, because that day they picked me up, bundled me into the back of a people carrier and took me to the edge of a park and told me to strip naked. They said, "You're heat, you're 5'0", man." And I remember looking at him thinking, you're too young to have seen Hawaii 5'0", but he's calling me 5'0", and it's amazing how slang travels through the generations, really. But that was a terrifying experience, and I thought I was going to die on that occasion. and on another occasion on that operation. But I thought, well, it's worth it. You know, I've caught everybody, 96 people. There were police from 5 different counties brought in to help do the raids. Everyone arrested, the 6 gangsters arrested. I knew where the drugs were stashed, where the money was kept. Anyway, I got a phone call from the intelligence officer who was keeping his ear to the ground to follow, you know, what the aftermath was on the streets, the word on the streets. And he said to me on the phone, yep, we managed to interrupt the drug supply for a full 2 hours. A full 2 hours. 7 months of work, almost getting myself killed, 96 people arrested, and no one went without. 2 hours later, there was a new phone call. Now, I can't say for sure that it's the famous rivals of the Burger Bar Boys, the Johnson crew, which took up that opportunity, but you can picture the scene. When they got the phone call, they hear what the police have done, and they would have said, put the call in, boys. We're going to make a fortune this weekend because the police have got rid of our rivals. So there's a constant replenishing of people. The opportunity in the drug trade is always taken up. But, and this is the important point, 6 major gangsters went to prison. And that was a success, or seen as a success. And there are similar successes around the United Kingdom and around the world. The police are always arresting drug dealers. And there's always a development in this arms race. There's always a tactic in response to that success. And the response to that success, the success that I had in the United Kingdom, is using children. Because children are the ultimate buffer zone between the police and the gangster. It protects them to use children. They're an inexhaustible supply. They're easy to manipulate and intimidate. They're cheap labor. They don't have to pay them as much. But the most important thing is it's a strategic response to policing. It would not have happened if we had not had success in policing drugs and arresting the dealers. It's a perfectly natural response. As soon as the heroin market was gifted to organised crime at the end of the 1960s in the United Kingdom, that put us on the path the inevitable path that would bring us to this point where we now have children on the front line. Now, if you'd spoken to a heroin dealer in the mid-1970s when he was just starting to make his money from heroin, and if you had a time machine and you could go back and say to him, your trade in a few decades' time will be using children to protect people like you from going to jail, that heroin dealer would probably be quite insulted. He would say, no way would I ever do that. But this is what prohibition has done. It has corrupted our society so much that organised crime are willing to do things that in the past they would not have done. And we are only going in one direction with this dark philosophy, with this using of vulnerable people. And only by legal regulation can we end this. Only by legal regulation can we protect those children. Now, there may be some of you listening now who are involved in the safeguarding, protection or recovery of children who have been used in this way. And I want to leave you with a really uncomfortable thought. There were raids earlier on in the year, and the government announced that a couple of hundred children were rescued from this exploitation. The uncomfortable thought I think we all need to dwell on is that where children are rescued, there will be more recruited to fill the gaps. We cannot lose sight of that, because the police never reduce the size of the market, never. But the police do change the shape of it. And there's 2 significant aspects to the way the economics have been shaped by policing. One is that because police get rid of the least successful gangsters, they're more likely to catch the low-hanging fruit. It means that monopolies are created where the bigger gangs expand to take advantage of what the police does. So we have more monopolisation at import and wholesale level. But on the other end, we have increased competition. We have more players on the streets wanting to make the money. And this is a response of police action, because the police are nibbling at the edges, creating opportunities. And just in my last few seconds, I'll make one last point. If people are listening and thinking, well, the kind of trafficking I've dealt with or read about has got nothing to do with the drug trade, it's about sexual slavery and rape. Well, the National Crime Agency in the United Kingdom, in their strategic assessments into organised crime, make this very important point, that the money from the illicit drugs market is reinvested into other forms of criminality. Now, we all know if we want to start a business, we need investment, we need the capital to do it. Well, the drug market is the bank of international organised crime. It makes their other activities possible. We have to start with the drugs. Drug policy is the way to reduce the power of organised crime.
Thank you very much there, Neil. As always, very eloquent in explaining the futility of the role of the police in trying to enforce our current drug policies, and if not actually making it actively worse to involve the current state of affairs where we have children being exploited through the trade. I'd like to move now to a question and answer session. So if people still have more questions, please do keep them coming in. The first question we've got in, I think I'll hand over. Well, in fact, anyone can answer this, but it's basically, the question was that LEAP are doing such great work around getting the police involved. How can we get the judiciary more involved with the drug policy reform movement? And the comment goes on to talk about the conflict of having the Modern Slavery Act, which is helping children not to get the sentencing in courts, but also that that is still in allowing this trend to continue, as you alluded to, Neil, in your talk, because it allows the continuation of children being exploited through this. Do you have any thoughts on that now?
Yeah, I'll come to the judiciary part second, if that's okay. The Modern Slavery Act, it may have shifted in some ways the views of law enforcement, or rather the law enforcement has been educated as a result of it, that children are victims and they're not just part of a criminal enterprise. But the trouble is, with the very loud intent from government that the Modern Slavery Act will increase sentences for people where evidence is proven that people have exploited children. There was even a political statement that the stigma attached with such a conviction would put people off. You know, it's a sort of ridiculous idea that you can use the threat of punitive action to prevent people making profit from the drug market. The problem with the Modern Slavery Act is that the sentences are increased. And this is always a problem, because wherever you increase the sentences, you increase the risk to those people being exploited. Because there is for example, if an organised crime group get an idea that a child might be susceptible to being persuaded by the police to provide information, then the automatic response of that organised crime group is to be more violent and intimidate them more, to terrify them into doing so. And so actions like the Modern Slavery Act, they just create an added status of danger, as does the suggestion, the push from government to recruit more child informants. And there is, you know, I've heard from sources, intelligence analysts, people who speak to us at LEAP, that there is a directive from above to recruit children as informants. Because, of course, children, one of the reasons that organised crime uses children is because they can't be infiltrated by the normal registered informants that the police already have on their books. So the trouble is, of course, as soon as organised crime know that the police are trying to recruit the kids, because the kids will go back and tell the people who are exploiting them what the cops said to them in the police station. As soon as they know this, then the blanket terror used to intimidate them will grow. So any policy at all, any action from a punitive standpoint will always put vulnerable people more at risk. As for the judiciary, it's a bit of we have a strange constitution for the way that the judiciary operate in the UK, because LEAP in the USA, we have judges, we have prosecutors, we have as many judges and prosecutors as we do senior police who speak for LEAP in the USA. And it is a desire of ours to find some allies within the judiciary. So if anyone's got any ideas, please send them our way.
Thank you very much, Neil. The next question we've got in, which might actually be for Neil as well, but here we go, is how do we measure, assess and overcome the role of corruption at the international, national and local level? Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, the short answer is we can't. As long as we have our current drug policy, we can't. There is no defence against corruption caused by the drug markets. There's none, and the problem is, as I tried to describe when I first spoke, the actions of police thin out the competition and create monopolies. So, and that's happened both at regional, national, and international levels. You look at Mexico, there used to be 20 cartels, now there are 3. But what that means is each one of those cartels is significantly more powerful in terms of the wealth that they have. More wealth means more disposable income, and that disposable income gets invested in corruption, which is why you have entire nation states being corrupted, like some of the West African countries. So it's a simple answer to question to answer, I think. It's just we can't unless we take the market away from organised crime. They have the money to corrupt the system as they like, and of course the big trouble is in our stable democracies, our politicians and our criminal justice system, everyone smugly thinks that everything is fine. And those that do understand how corrupted these systems are don't let the public know. And the reason for that is the Home Office, the government, has a long-standing instruction to the police to maintain public confidence. And this is the same in any nation, because the idea is that if the public lose confidence in the police, then society breaks down. But how ironic that is. If they told the truth to the public would be better informed and society would be less likely to break down. So the corruption is another one of those urgent reasons why we need regulated drug markets.
Thank you very much, Neil. I'd like to ask a question to both Coletta and Neil. What we've recognised at Transform is that trafficking groups and those involved with child protection have been very slow to get involved in this debate, hence the creation of this briefing. And there's a real sort of unwillingness to touch the issue of drug policy as opposed to the sectoral issue. What do you think are the major sort of barriers to this engagement, and how do you think we can start to overcome some of that to match up this narrative that we've talked about this evening? Do you have any thoughts on that? Shall I go to Neil? I'll go to Neil first.
Well, I think like most people, the majority of people don't yet realise the extent of the harms caused by drug policy. And the reason for that is that what we're told in the media and newspapers and by government, police even, that the way of measuring success in drug policy is the numbers of arrests and drug seizures. That's what we are taught to believe success looks like. And so it's a matter of reaching those audiences. Most people aren't even exposed to the observations that we're making in something like this. And of course, people who are active and working in trafficking and safeguarding people, they tend to be dedicated, hard-working people with a clear focus in front of them. And the wider policy issue isn't necessarily traditionally perhaps seen as the way to tackle this. And of course, we're not really offering any solutions to people out there right now dealing with what they're dealing with. If you're working with children rescued from county lines, my voice of doom saying you rescue some kids and there's more going to be corrupted. It's not very helpful, is it? But what is helpful, what I think what we need to do is to be aware of this so that we can advocate change wherever we can. And that, you know, we can all advocate change and engage with our politicians and councillors, whoever it is. You know, and it's only through these discussions and observations and this excellent report that you've produced that we can actually truly get to the bottom of this. I mean, I actually think this report is in some ways breaking new ground by tackling this in the way that you've done it. And so that's the answer, really.
Thank you, Neil. Over to Coletta.
You saw the look on my face. I was contemplating this question. I don't think there's an easy answer to it, particularly based on my experience in Latin America and the United States where I'm based. But I do feel like those of us working on drug policy issues and those working on human trafficking issues are really in their own silos. And I think the way we approach issues, and I may be speaking out of turn here because I don't have a lot of contact, which is part of the problem, right, with groups that are working exclusively on human trafficking. But I think, you know, the drug policy world, we tend to look at things from a bigger, more systematic, you know, how do we change the structures? How do we change the policies to mitigate the harms caused by, you know, both drugs and drug policies? Whereas, as Neil pointed out, I think those working on human trafficking tend to see it as more of a rescue operation of individuals as opposed to confronting the system. I think there are very different ideological approaches in both cases. And I think in the case of the Western Hemisphere, although I suppose it carries over into other areas, is looking at the sources of funding. You know, the US government puts a lot of money into groups working on human trafficking and rescuing people who've been victims of human trafficking. They're also putting a lot of money into existing drug control operations. So I think that sets up an automatic tension, more than a tension, you know, conflict in bringing those people bringing people together to debate the issues in a more objective way. So I think that is a particularly big challenge. And I think we should be thinking creatively about how we can start building bridges of dialogue, which is really where it has to start, no? Understanding what each group is doing in a better way. I also want to shout out to Milka, if I'm pronouncing that right, who has a question in the chat about the intersections of race and class in the drug market, which of course is a huge issue in my country, the United States right now, and we haven't talked about it, and it is so fundamentally important. You know, we see across the region that Afro-descendants, people of color, indigenous groups, the Black people in the United States are the primary victims of, you know, punitive drug policies. And, you know, particularly in my own country, it's, you know, beyond well documented that, you know, far more people of color are in prison for drug offenses than white people, even though they don't consume greater quantities of drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And what's really interesting, of course, in the States right now is how finally we are seeing, you know, this debate, this issue spilling out into the streets. And, you know, to have had these protests going on since they started in June and they continue. You know, I live in Washington, D.C. A day has not gone by. I don't remember, I think it started at the very beginning of June, if I remember correctly. We have had people marching in the streets for Black Lives Matter every single day. It's shocking to me that police are still killing Black people, even as, you know, the whole country is riveted around this discussion. But I think it just underscores the depth of the problem. And I could go on at length about this and I won't, but I do think it's really important that we bring race into this discussion.
No, and thank you for that, Coletta. I'd missed that in the side panel there, so thanks for bringing it back to that. And just for anyone listening to say that isn't an exclusively US problem, and I think all the stats in the UK show those problems, although very infrequently talked about in the UK context. Look at the statistics, and our statistics are very much mirror the pattern of the US. With the racial discrepancies and disproportionate impact on particularly Black communities in the UK here too. I think we can ask one more question here. and this one is actually quite a positive question, which is why I perhaps pulled it out to sort of try and conclude on. And the question is, are there some international examples of positive impacts on the trafficking and exploitation through drug law reform? And they say e.g. in Portugal or Switzerland, but actually that instantly made me think to the US and or to places that have legalized cannabis. And I wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that. Would you like to take that one, Coletta? Or?
Sure. But let's talk about Uruguay. Uruguay was the first country in the world to create a legal regulated cannabis market. Critics said that this was going to create all kinds of problems, that Uruguay was going to become an international pariah, that neighboring countries would have kids flocking to Uruguay to get high, that there would be all kinds of negative consequences, et cetera, et cetera. None of that has happened. I'm trying to remember the year now. It's been, what, 5, 6 years that Uruguay implemented this very important change. And basically what we found is that it certainly had issues in terms of getting the system in place. I won't go into too much detail here, but primarily because of banking issues. And because in the original legislation, it was mandated that the cannabis be sold in pharmacies, which I would recommend any other country that's considering this not to do that, because it created a lot of hurdles. But overall, it has functioned well, and nobody questions it. A right-wing government just came into power. Not only did they continue, they're not doing anything to change that approach, but they also put in a person who had supported the whole effort as a senator, who's now head of their national drug board. So I think Uruguay is a really good example of how you can do this and the sky doesn't fall. And that's of course been the case in other in the United States. There's a lot of dubious reports out about, increased stoned driving and stuff like that. But the bottom line is that, depending, with different issues in the different states that have regulated, things have gone relatively well. And we've seen in some cases, there's some studies that show reductions in problematic drinking, which is, alcohol being a much bigger problem in terms of health and dependency issues. I think it's also interesting to look at the United States, look at Latin America. You have Uruguay, we now have Canada, similar situation. And Mexico is in the process of creating legal regulated markets. The Congress has till the end of the year to put that into place. And it's clear that in the United States that we are moving in that direction. There's actually a law pending right now for the federal government to allow for legal regulated markets. If my memory is correct, it would allow for states to decide, but it would remove right now, US states have a conundrum because cannabis is still illegal at the federal level. And if we were to have a Democratic administration in place following the upcoming elections, I think it's pretty clear that that kind of legislation will get passed. So we may be in a situation in the not too distant future where we have North America as a continent with legal regulated cannabis markets. And I think that presents a tremendous challenge to those who are opposed to that. And I would just say one other thing, another small country like Uruguay that has implemented some interesting reforms within the context of the criminal justice system is Costa Rica, and particularly with a focus on women. Costa Rica for many years was sort of the leader, along with Uruguay, in developing a more gender-sensitive approach to drug policy. One of the things they did was pass a law that dropped the sentence for women who smuggle drugs into prison. You'll remember Jessica, the woman I mentioned earlier. They reduced the penalty from 8 to 3 years. And because it was reduced to 3 years, it meant that women automatically had the option of alternatives to incarceration. This allowed 150 women to get out of prison. and women are no longer going to prison for that particular offense. There was, again, a lot of fear at the time that other vulnerable populations would become involved in smuggling the drugs into prison, particularly trans people, but that has not transpired. And the other thing that Costa Rica did that's really important is they created an interinstitutional support network at the governmental level. So sort of like a one-stop shop for government services where women could go to get help with finding housing, with finding employment, and figuring out how to get their kids back when they get out of prison. And it's been somewhat dismantled with the present government, but it was doing very well in helping women coming out of prison, basically get back on their feet. And then finally, one last example, they keep rolling into my head as I talk. After doing that, Costa Rica, I think, is the only country in the world that has done this. They've adopted a law that allowed judges to eliminate criminal records of anyone who's committed a nonviolent offense, men or women, if they did that when they were living in a situation of vulnerability. Largely related to poverty, but also, mothers of, with children, that sort of thing. And that means essentially that you can come out of prison without a criminal record. And we all know what the criminal record means in terms of your inability to get meaningful employment, to get gainful employment when you are released. So I think that there are examples out there beyond Portugal and some of the other well-known cases of where these kinds of reforms can really make a difference in people's lives.
Thank you very much, Coletta. And for all those doomsayers out there who say that reform of our drug laws will never be possible, I always think it's good to return to the many countries that have, of course, innovated around this. And whilst, of course, we would probably all argue that legal regulation is, of course, no silver bullet, I think what we can see is that where markets are legal, we do not see trafficking and exploitation of children in the same way as we do in the illegal market. And that is why I do think that if we could legally regulate the drugs market, we will remove a major source of this exploitation and trafficking. And that leads us to a really key point of the briefing, I think, that we're trying to make. I want to just offer the panelists an opportunity to make any concluding comment that they might want to make with no pressure at all. No.
I take the opportunity to congratulate Transform and Anyone's Child again for this report. I think it can really help us open the doors that we've been talking about needing to open in this discussion. And we should continue to think strategically about how to disseminate the report and how to use it to engage folks in discussion around this issue. So congrats, y'all done a great job.
Oh, well, thank you very much to Ester, Coletta and Neil for your really powerful and thought-provoking talks. And let's continue this conversation. If anyone is listening from any trafficking organisation, please do get in contact. We'd love to continue this discussion, hear some of those barriers and work together on how we might be able to work together going forward. And please do take a look at the briefing that we've written, and we'll be circulating a short survey at the end of this webinar. Please do complete it. It will help us to make our work better and more interesting for you all. So thank you very much and good night to everyone. Thank you.